having said that, I feel it's important for me to flag four very important aspects of groundwater in India. First of all, India depends hugely on groundwater resources. And the diversity of both biophysical and socio-economic conditions around these resources manifests itself in many ways. Second, most groundwater use in India is atomistic. It's used by millions of farmers, largely in the rural landscape, but more so in the urban and industrial sectors as well. Third, it's a bit of a blind spot. Perhaps lesser so in the rural space than in the urban space. And fourth, the reason why I'm here, and in this primary discussion on the interface between academia and practice. It's going back 35 years, and one of the reasons I left my job at Pune University 15 years ago was to study a subject which was a bit of a blind spot, but a subject which required intense engagement on the ground, because this is a subject from which you can derive science and research only in the living laboratory of nature. So, just running through a few slides, there are three very recent developments with regard to groundwater in India. First is this whole context of putting some resources into mapping our groundwater and mapping groundwater depletion. Second is looking at the larger programs, some of the sort of reforms in the larger programs. So, for instance, in the MGNREGA, sort of the Rural Employment Guarantee Program, something about wells, and wells being a bit of a common pool rather than individual assets. And third, enactment of laws on groundwater by something like 13 states. So, these are the large, big picture developments on groundwater in India, I must say. And I think this needs to be viewed in context of India's unique story on groundwater irrigation, which gets discussed largely around canals, large dams, the surface water development. And then there's like the sort of 30 million, 40 million, 50 million farmer stories, which talks about diversity, which talks about risk reduction as a part of groundwater management by millions of farmers in India. And it's a big contrast that you see, and we come across this contrast in many, many political and policy debates. And in some ways, this atomistic groundwater development has given rise to very interesting geographies of groundwater development. So the northwest of India and the southeast part of India are today one of the most intensively irrigated regions in the world. And at the same time, they are the most groundwater exploited regions in India. And you can see those colors, so the colored pockets are the ones where groundwater exploitation has happened at large scales and in a very intensive manner. On the right hand side is a map which is a simplified map of groundwater pollution and groundwater contamination. And you can see there's a bit of a correlation there. So in many ways, it tells a very unique story where India's groundwater resources are concerned. And this story also has other elements to it, like questions on credit support, the whole question of energy and energy subsidies, which is mired around three broad elements. The first is in terms of subsidies, free electricity tariffs. Second is in terms of rationed electricity to curb groundwater extraction, like what's being done in Gujarat. Third is extreme regulation on groundwater, what has happened in West Bengal for many, many years. And there's a bit of an energy squeeze. A lot of people have written about it, that the energy squeeze in places in states like West Bengal have actually precluded poor farmers from access to groundwater. So I think, I'm sort of just citing this example because groundwater is a blind spot, not just because the resource can't be completely seen, but because a lot of our policies have revolved around how groundwater is extracted and how different states perceive their groundwater resources. And I think now, having looked at those northwestern pockets of groundwater exploitation, we are looking at bringing the green revolution to eastern India. And this is just a map from sort of the central government data, which talks about the grey areas being largely the rain-fed areas. And from our observation for the last 20 to 30 years, we've seen that even within those grey areas, there are extremely heavy pockets of groundwater extraction leading to exploitation. So the larger picture doesn't really capture the scale, the sort of local scale picture on the ground, where groundwater is concerned. But also the argument being made is the productivity levels of rice and rice-based cropping systems are about the lowest in the region when compared to the other states, the eastern India regions. And I think that's where we begin to look at this whole paradigm of bringing green revolution to eastern India. And I think we must look at this very carefully, because if you look at the eastern India plateau, which is that gray map over there, which is parts of Jharkhand, parts of Bihar, West Bengal, and parts of Odisha and Chhattisgarh. And if you look at the rainfall regimes, most of this area is 1000 millimeters plus. And I come from a state where rainfall, or I come from a district where rainfall fluctuates between 3500 millimeters to 200 millimeters in Maharashtra. And for me, it's very interesting when I look at sort of the eastern India plateau. And in some ways, these rainfall regimes are probably prompting a lot of policymakers to think of eastern India differently, primarily because of the rainfall regimes. But having said that, if you look at the geological conditions, which really dictate groundwater occurrence and movement in these regions, it's very, very different from both the northwestern India and the southeastern India, where groundwater exploitation has happened and there have been experiences of that. So this is largely what is known as a crystalline basement region, which is different from the alluvial systems of the northwest, of the Punjab, of the UP, of Haryana, or parts of Rajasthan, where you have extensive alluvial aquifers, extensive deposits of sand, gravel, clay, silt, which make up very, very regional aquifers. So as against that, we are looking at sort of East India plateau, which is largely about local aquifers, moderate to low groundwater storages, very, very small pockets. So those are just two cartoons of depicting these two settings. And given the overexploitation of groundwater around some of the other areas in India, it's interesting to note that we could reach what took sort of 20 to 25 years to happen in Punjab. If we follow the same trajectory of water resources, intensive water resources development in agriculture, I think we are going to reach the limits of exploitation much sooner, much quicker as compared to what happened in other parts of India. So I'm now, in the sort of given that background, I'm going to talk a little bit about the areas in which we are part of this collaboration between ACIR and Pradhan on the Eastern India plateau. So 3 locations which throw up a huge amount of local variability. So these are geological settings and the aquifer settings that we've defined. But to kind of give you a sense of a greater degree of variability in access, we find that in the lowermost part there, which is Bugui in Ramgarh, there are 60 wells in that village, and in the other 2 there are about 15 wells in the village. So it's not reached those levels of overexploitation which we are normally accustomed to working for the last 10 to 15 years. where, for instance, in a couple of villages where we are working in Maharashtra, there are 1,000 wells in a similar setting. So we are still looking at groundwater resources that are pretty much intact, which are pretty much in some kind of a pristine setting. And the reason I'm saying this is because many of these aquifers, and this is data which is emerging and which needs to be sharpened a little more, most of the aquifers in these settings have a higher limit of groundwater storage of about 150 millimeters, which is annually replenishable, which can be annually recharged. And I think we need to sort of now get into these kind of quantification when we look at some of these settings. So we have a lot of spatial and temporal variability. The other reason I want to sort of flag the specific case of the Eastern India Plateau is in terms of the spatial and temporal variability of water resources in general and groundwater in particular. In Churinchora, for example, most of the wells are located in the uplands. The concentration of wells in the uplands. And if you look at the groundwater water table contour map below, it indicates to you that these are the most impermeable parts of, or the less permeable parts of the aquifer. And this in itself creates a paradox of sorts when we go in with a conventional watershed program, where you have the upstream versus downstream water endowment issues. So you have upstream parts where there's heavy access, and you have downstream parts where there's actually reasonable amount of groundwater storage. I don't even want to sound judgmental in terms of what are the approaches we take, but this is one clear issue. The second question is about the rainfall itself. And these are sort of two long-term graphs from two districts, Ramgarh and West Singhu, where you can see that if you look at a 100-year rainfall plot, you can see that there's actually some indication of a depletion, whether you look at a sort of linear trend or whether you look at a moving average of about 10 to 12 years, which kind of looks at the cyclicity. So that's the kind of diversity we are looking at. We are also looking at what is known as interannual and seasonal variability, dry spells between rainy days. And I'd like to sort of stop a little here, pause a little here, and go back to the earlier presentation that Ashok made. I think this is something that we actually learn. I think somebody raised a question about, okay, we bring in the knowledge, but what do we get in return? And I think one of the greatest experience I've had from this area over the last 2 to 3 years has been that when we look at data like this, and when we've been talking to farmers, we can actually sense that farmers tend to understand this interannual and seasonal variability in a slightly more qualitative sense. But there's a very close match. And I think that close match itself paves the way for a very proactive dialogue, for the cross-learning to happen, for people to change their actions, for people to change behavior, and also for us to adjust our research design in many more ways than one. Now, yeah, 5 minutes? Okay. I'll just finish with 2 slides. I want to sort of, I'd like to sort of, maybe 4 slides. We've looked at hard rock aquifers in many parts of India. And this is what I wouldn't want to happen. So the entire research has to be oriented towards something that shouldn't happen. This is an aquifer which we studied in the hard rock regions of West Central India for 15 years. We studied one aquifer for 15 years. We worked in one village for 15 years only to look at what's happening, what are the dynamics around that aquifer. We didn't try to influence people's behavior at that point in time, because that was not the order of the day, or neither was it fashionable. But we were just trying to track what is happening in an area. And we could actually see that the pre and post monsoon water levels in the aquifer dropped significantly. Today we are working in the same village. We went back to the village after 10 to 15 years, and we find that the aquifer, the water levels, the groundwater levels in the aquifer are actually fluctuating right at the bottom of the aquifer. So the farmers have only about 15% of the total groundwater stock that could be made available in the aquifer, and that's where they are operating. Whereas sort of 30, 40 years ago, it was a very different situation. Now, whether rainfall is a culprit for all of this, and it isn't. If you look at the sort of 13 years, 11, 12 years of rainfall, you can see that there are years of below average, 3 years of below average rainfall, 5 years of average rainfall, and 3 years of more than average rainfall. And despite this fact, the aquifer has been progressively desaturated over these 15 to 20 years. Now, that actually brings us to this question, which I sort of want to flag as one of the core questions on this collaborative research that we are doing. That an aquifer is an entity in many dimensions. As it goes through various phases of development, groundwater abstraction increases, the agrarian economy changes, so you go from a boom phase to a bust phase, the energy demand or the energy input increases, the drinking water security often gets a beating, and so does the whole question of environmental flows or base flows that are contributions from the aquifer. And the larger question, of course, is how does soil water behave under these scenarios? And soil water, therefore, we believe, and we have actually have some evidence that's coming out, is soil water actually behaves differently under these different scenarios of aquifer exploitation. So now, let me jump to sort of my last slide, which is the need for collaboration. I think, while I come at it from a very aquifer-centric point of view, I think it involves disciplines like soil, social elements, the whole question of common pool resources. So the problem itself is of an interdisciplinary nature. It needs bridging the gaps between research, practice, and policy. It needs certain scientific, technical, and social inputs. And it needs implementing organizations, multiple organizations, because no single organization can work on multiple disciplines. And integrating science into society needs a huge amount of collaboration. So having said that, I don't want to run through all of these, but I'll just sort of flag what are the challenges that you come across this kind of research. And we've been doing this kind of research in other parts of India as well.
And you flag it in 1 minute.
Yeah, okay. The first one is pedagogical, or even ideological. Because very often what happens is my discipline is most important, that kind of a scenario. The second is conceptual, which involves gaps in integrating interdisciplinary concepts into collaborative works. The third can actually be a conflict of interest, because one can say that, okay, when you're looking at aquifers as common pool, then you may be precluding some kind of economic development. Third is, how do you take research and theory into practice? And that actually proves to be a bit of a challenge at the field level often. Fourth, how do you engage with policy? When you're working at sort of 2 or 3 villages at the level, at the scale of villages, how do you engage with policy? So I think that's the broad canvas on which I'm looking at the next 1.5 days and trying to learn, to get inputs on these. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Siddharth. I don't think that we have time for questions, but this is where I remind people to scribble whatever questions or thoughts went through your mind onto the brown paper in front of you. And one of them that I would have scribbled where I was sitting at my desk is, I'm curious to know what is groundwater abstraction. But anyway, we'll come back to that later. So next up is Bill Bellotti from the University